August 1991. A modest conference room in Seoul, South Korea. 67-year-old Kim Hak-sun sits before a crowd of reporters, her hands trembling as she holds a microphone. For 46 years, she has carried a secret that has eaten away at her soul like acid. For 46 years, she has lived in shame for crimes committed against her. Today, she becomes the first woman to publicly testify about being forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during World War II. Her voice shakes as she speaks, but her words are clear and devastating. I was 14 years old when they took me. I want the world to know what happened to us. I want Japan to acknowledge what they did. Her testimony breaks open a dam of silence. Within months, hundreds of elderly women across Asia begin coming forward with similar stories, each one adding another piece to a historical horror that had been deliberately buried for half a century. These women, now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, finally find the courage to speak about the unspeakable, to demand recognition for suffering that their societies had forced them to hide, to reclaim identities that had been stolen when they were barely more than children. This is the story of the Comfort Women, a Japanese euphemism that sanitizes one of World War II's most systematic and brutal campaigns of sexual violence. Between 1932 and 1945, the Japanese military forcibly recruited between 50,000 and 200,000 women and girls from across Asia into sexual slavery, creating a network of military brothels that followed Japanese troops throughout their conquered territories. The women came from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and even small numbers from the Netherlands and Australia. They were promised factory work or nursing positions. They were kidnapped from their homes. They were purchased from impoverished families. They were deceived, coerced, and trafficked into a system designed to provide sexual services to Japanese soldiers while maintaining military discipline and preventing the spread of venereal disease. The system was bureaucratic, organized, and completely official, operating with the full knowledge and support of the Japanese military command. Military documents detailed the establishment of comfort stations, the transportation of women, the medical examinations and treatments, the pricing structures and operational procedures. This was not the chaotic, opportunistic violence that often accompanies military conflict. This was planned, implemented, and maintained as military policy, with comfort stations appearing wherever Japanese forces established control, from the frozen landscapes of Manchuria to the tropical islands of the Pacific. For decades after the war ended, these women remained silent, trapped by shame and social stigma that blamed victims rather than perpetrators, isolated by cultures that valued female chastity above female suffering, abandoned by governments that prioritized diplomatic relations over historical justice. But in 1991, Kim Hak-sun's testimony began a movement that would force the world to confront this hidden history, that would give voice to women who had been silenced by trauma and society's complicity in that silence, that would demand accountability from a nation that had tried to erase this chapter from its historical narrative. To understand the magnitude of what was done to these women, we must begin with the individual stories that statistics cannot capture. Numbers tell us that tens of thousands of women were enslaved, but numbers cannot convey what it meant to be 13 years old, sitting in a classroom in Korea, when Japanese soldiers arrived and selected girls for what they called essential war work. Numbers cannot express the terror of being locked in a room and raped by dozens of soldiers daily. Numbers cannot measure the psychological destruction of being reduced to an object, a military supply, disposable and replaceable. Lee Ok-seon was born in 1927 in Busan, Korea. During the period when Korea was under Japanese colonial occupation, her family was poor. Her father a farmer who struggled to feed his children on land that Japanese authorities had appropriated for their own agricultural programs. At 15, Lee was approached by a Korean man who worked for the Japanese authorities. a collaborator who made his living recruiting young women for what he described as factory work in Japan. The pay would be good, he told her family. She could send money home. She would learn valuable skills. Her parents, desperate and believing the promises, agreed to let her go. Lee traveled with a group of other Korean girls, all teenagers, all excited about the opportunity to work in Japan and help their families. They took a ship across the sea, chattering about what factory work might be like, imagining the clothes they would buy with their wages, planning how much money they would send home. When the ship docked, they were loaded onto trucks and driven not to factories, but to a large house surrounded by barbed wire in Manchuria, territory that Japan had seized from China and renamed Manchukuo. The house was a comfort station, one of thousands that the Japanese military had established throughout its occupied territories. The girls were separated into individual rooms, each one containing only a futon and a small table. Lee's room had a number on the door, number 7, the designation that soldiers would use when selecting her. That first night, she understood what had been done to her. She was not in Japan. She was not going to work in a factory. She had been trafficked into sexual slavery, and there was no escape. For the next 3 years, from age 15 to 18, Lee serviced Japanese soldiers in that comfort station. The routine was brutal and mechanized. Soldiers would arrive after their evening meal, forming queues outside the rooms. Each man received a ticket indicating his allotted time, typically 30 minutes. Lee was expected to service between 20 and 30 soldiers per day. More on weekends when the military base received reinforcements or when troops were about to deploy to combat zones. The physical damage was severe and constant. The psychological destruction was complete. The comfort station operated according to strict military regulations that revealed the system's official nature. Medical officers conducted weekly examinations of the women, not out of concern for their health, but to prevent the spread of venereal disease among soldiers. Women who became pregnant were forced to undergo abortions, often without anesthesia or proper medical care. Those who became too sick or injured to continue were sometimes killed, sometimes abandoned, always replaced by new recruits brought from Korea or China or the Philippines. Lee attempted escape twice. The first time she was caught within hours and beaten so severely that she couldn't walk for a week. The second time, she managed to hide in the countryside for 3 days before being recaptured. The punishment was public, designed to discourage other women from attempting similar flight. She was stripped and beaten in front of the other comfort women and the soldiers, her body marked as warning and spectacle. After that, she stopped trying to escape physically and instead retreated into psychological survival mechanisms that would take decades to overcome. The women developed their own community within the horror, supporting each other in ways that their captors never intended or anticipated. They shared food when individual portions were insufficient. They tended to each other's injuries when military doctors refused treatment. They whispered plans that went nowhere and shared memories of homes that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. These small acts of solidarity were resistance in the only form available to them, assertions of humanity in a system designed to deny their personhood. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the Philippines, 16-year-old Maria Rosa Henson was experiencing a different route into the same system. Maria came from a poor rural family outside Manila. When Japanese forces invaded the Philippines in 1941, the occupation transformed life for Filipino civilians in ways that ranged from inconvenient to catastrophic. Japanese soldiers requisitioned food and supplies, imposed strict curfews, and treated the local population with casual brutality that reflected their military's view of conquered peoples as inherently inferior. In 1943, Japanese soldiers came to Maria's village conducting what they called recruitment for essential services. Unlike Lee Ok-seon's deception through false promises of factory work, Maria's recruitment was straightforward abduction. Soldiers surrounded her home, dragged her from her family despite her mother's screaming protests, and loaded her onto a truck with 8 other young women from surrounding villages. They were driven to a garrison where a comfort station had been established in a former school building. Maria's experience differed from Lee's in the degree of violence, but not in its fundamental horror. The Philippine comfort stations operated with less bureaucratic organization than those in Manchuria or Korea, but the sexual slavery was equally systematic and brutal. Maria was held in that garrison for 9 months, servicing Japanese soldiers who treated her with a combination of entitlement and contempt that came from military culture that dehumanized both enemy populations and the women forced to serve their soldiers' sexual desires. During those 9 months, Maria became pregnant, a common occurrence in comfort stations despite military regulations requiring soldiers to use condoms to prevent disease transmission. When her pregnancy became visible, she was beaten by the station's manager, a Japanese civilian who oversaw the operation of multiple comfort stations in the region. The beating was intended to induce miscarriage, a brutal form of abortion that the system preferred to the expense and inconvenience of medical procedures. Maria survived the beating, but lost the pregnancy, an experience that left her unable to bear children in the future, a source of grief that would compound the trauma of her enslavement. Maria's liberation came not through official rescue, but through the chaos of war's end. As American forces advanced through the Philippines in 1945, Japanese troops abandoned their positions with increasing frequency, sometimes killing comfort women before retreating, sometimes simply leaving them locked in the stations to starve or escape as they could manage. Maria's station was abandoned when American artillery began targeting the garrison. She and 3 other surviving women managed to break out through a window and flee into the surrounding jungle, where they hid for several days before American soldiers found them. The American soldiers who discovered them provided medical care and food, but also treated them with suspicion and moral judgment that reflected broader attitudes about women who had been sexually used by enemy forces. The liberating soldiers couldn't always distinguish between women who had been enslaved and women who had voluntarily associated with Japanese forces, and their assumptions often defaulted to blaming the women regardless of circumstances. Maria and the others were processed through American military channels, given minimal medical attention, and then essentially abandoned to find their own way home. When Maria returned to her village months after liberation, she discovered that her family had been killed during the Japanese occupation. She had no home to return to, no support network to help her rebuild her life. Worse, when villagers learned she had been in a comfort station, they treated her as contaminated, someone who had collaborated with the enemy through her sexual service, regardless of the fact that her service had been forced. The social stigma was immediate and comprehensive, making it impossible for her to reintegrate into the community she had once called home. Across Asia, similar stories multiplied with horrifying variations. In China, comfort women were recruited from both the local Chinese population and from Korea, with Chinese women often facing even more brutal treatment due to racial animosity that Japanese military culture directed toward Chinese people. Young Mingzhen was 13 when Japanese soldiers raided her village in Shanxi province in 1942, killing the men and elderly, taking the young women for use in comfort stations that served Japanese forces fighting communist and nationalist Chinese armies. Yang's captivity lasted 3 years, during which she was moved between multiple comfort stations as Japanese forces repositioned in response to Chinese military campaigns. Each transfer meant adjustment to new conditions, new routines, new forms of violence. Some stations were relatively organized, operating according to the military regulations that governed the comfort women system. Others were chaotic temporary facilities where military discipline broke down and violence against the women intensified, beyond even the system's normalized brutality. The end of the war brought liberation, but not freedom. When Soviet forces entered Manchuria in August 1945, advancing rapidly through territory that Japanese forces had occupied for years, They encountered comfort stations and responded with their own forms of violence against the Japanese military infrastructure they found. Some Soviet soldiers liberated comfort women with genuine compassion, providing medical care and safe passage. Others saw the women as spoils of war themselves. Continuing the cycle of sexual violence under new perpetrators, Young managed to escape during the chaos of Soviet advance, fleeing the comfort station with several other Chinese women when their Japanese guards abandoned the facility to avoid capture. They walked for weeks, begging for food, hiding from both Soviet and Chinese forces, trying to reach Yang's home village. When she finally arrived, emaciated and traumatized, she discovered that her family had been killed during Japanese reprisals against villages suspected of supporting communist forces. She had no one to return to, no life to reclaim. The post-war years brought new forms of suffering for comfort, women who survived. Most returned to societies that blamed them for their victimization, cultures that valued female chastity so highly that rape victims were treated as damaged goods regardless of the violence done to them. Families refused to take them back. Potential husbands rejected them as unmarriageable. Communities ostracized them as contaminated by their association with enemy soldiers. The women who had survived years of systematic sexual slavery now faced decades of social death, forced to hide their histories and live with shame for crimes committed against them. Lee Oki-seon, who had been enslaved from age 15 to 18, returned to Korea after liberation, but told no one about her experience. She invented a false history, claiming she had worked in a factory in Japan, a lie that required constant maintenance and increasing elaboration over the years. She never married, understanding that marriage would require intimacy and disclosure that she couldn't provide. She worked low-wage jobs, living in poverty and isolation, carrying her secret like a disease that couldn't be cured or shared. For 46 years, Lee lived this lie, watching as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse while denying responsibility for wartime atrocities. She watched as diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan normalized, trade agreements were signed, cultural exchanges celebrated, all while the comfort women system was erased from official histories. The Japanese government claimed that comfort women had been private contractors working for civilian businessmen, not military slaves operating under official policy. The documentation that existed was dismissed as insufficient or misinterpreted. The women's testimony was discounted as unreliable memory corrupted by time and bias. Maria Rosa Henson, in the Philippines, also remained silent for decades, unable to speak about her experience even to close friends or family. She married in her 30s, a relationship that was complicated by her inability to have children and her psychological trauma from the comfort station experience. She worked as a vendor in Manila's markets, selling vegetables and household goods, living an outwardly normal life that concealed the interior devastation she carried. The silence was enforced not just by social stigma, but by active suppression from governments that prioritized political relationships over historical justice. South Korea, dependent on American military support during the Cold War and seeking economic partnership with Japan, discouraged public discussion of wartime grievances that might disrupt diplomatic progress. The Philippines, also aligned with American interests and seeking Japanese investment for post-war reconstruction, similarly minimized attention to wartime atrocities. China, isolated during the Cultural Revolution and focused on internal political struggles, had little capacity to address historical justice for comfort women even if political will had existed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the 1980s, Japanese feminist scholars and activists began researching the comfort women system, driven not by nationalist politics, but by feminist commitment to documenting women's experiences of war. Historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki discovered documents in Japan's Self-Defense Agency archives that conclusively proved the military's direct involvement in establishing and operating comfort stations. The documents detailed the system's organization, including orders from military command authorizing the establishment of comfort stations, regulations governing their operation, and medical protocols for examining the women. These discoveries energized a growing movement of activists in Korea, the Philippines, China, and other affected countries who had been pushing for recognition of comfort women's experiences. Yoshimi's research provided documentation that Japanese government denials could no longer dismiss. The historical evidence was undeniable, official, and damning. The Japanese military had created, managed, and profited from a system of sexual slavery that victimized tens of thousands of women across Asia. In this context, Kim Hak-sun made her decision to break her silence. In August 1991, she held a press conference in Seoul and became the first former comfort woman to publicly identify herself and testify about her experiences. She described being 14 when a Korean collaborator took her to China under false pretenses. She detailed the years of sexual slavery and comfort stations. She demanded apology and compensation from the Japanese government. Her courage was extraordinary, given the social stigma that still attached to comfort women in Korean society, the risk of public shame and family disgrace that her disclosure invited. Kim's testimony opened the floodgates. Within months, dozens of other elderly women in Korea came forward with their own stories. Then hundreds, former comfort women in the Philippines, Taiwan, China, Indonesia, and other countries began speaking publicly, their testimonies remarkably consistent despite coming from different countries and different types of comfort stations. They described the same recruitment methods, the same brutal conditions, the same systematic organization, the same official military involvement. The Japanese government initially responded with denials and minimizations. Government officials claimed that comfort women had been prostitutes working voluntarily for private contractors, that the military had merely regulated existing prostitution rather than creating a system of forced sexual labor. These claims became increasingly untenable as more documentation emerged and more survivors testified with detailed, consistent accounts that contradicted the government's narrative. In 1993, facing overwhelming evidence and international pressure, the Japanese government issued the Kono Statement, an official acknowledgement that the comfort women system had existed and that military authorities had been directly involved in its establishment and operation. The statement expressed apologies and remorse, but stopped short of accepting full legal responsibility or offering direct compensation to survivors. The carefully worded acknowledgement attempted to balance historical admission with limitation of legal liability, satisfying neither justice advocates nor nationalist conservatives who opposed any admission of wrongdoing. The survivors found the Kono Statement insufficient. They wanted not just acknowledgement but compensation, education about the system in Japanese schools, and full legal accountability for the crimes committed. They filed lawsuits in Japanese courts seeking damages, most of which were dismissed on technical grounds or rejected based on statutes of limitations. They held weekly protests outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, a demonstration that began in 1992 and continues to this day, making it one of the longest-running protest movements in history. Lee Ok-seon, who had hidden her history for 46 years before Kim Hak-sun's testimony gave her courage to speak, became one of the movement's most prominent voices. She testified at international hearings, spoke at universities, participated in documentaries, transforming her experience from source of private shame into public advocacy for historical justice. The activism gave her life purpose that had been absent during the decades of silence, but it also meant repeatedly reliving trauma, describing her enslavement to audiences who sometimes believed her and sometimes questioned her credibility. The psychological cost of public testimony was enormous. Many survivors who came forward experienced severe depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other mental health consequences from speaking about experiences they had suppressed for decades. Some developed physical symptoms, psychosomatic illnesses triggered by the stress of public exposure, and the emotional work of advocacy. But they persisted because they understood that silence had protected perpetrators while destroying victims, and that breaking silence was the only path toward historical justice and social recognition. The international community gradually responded to the survivors' advocacy. In 2007, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution calling on Japan to formally acknowledge and apologize for the comfort women system. Similar resolutions followed from the parliaments of the Netherlands, Canada, and the European Union. The United Nations issued multiple reports documenting the system and recommending compensation and education. These international interventions increased pressure on the Japanese government, but also triggered nationalist backlash within Japan from groups who viewed the comfort women issue as anti-Japanese propaganda rather than historical fact. The domestic Japanese response to comfort women advocacy revealed deep divisions within Japanese society about how to remember and address wartime history. Progressive activists and intellectuals supported the survivors and pushed for fuller acknowledgement and compensation. Conservative nationalists argued that Japan was being unfairly singled out for practices that were common in warfare. The comfort women had been prostitutes working voluntarily, that survivor testimony was unreliable or fabricated. These historical denials were not fringe positions but appeared in mainstream political discourse, including from elected officials and government appointees. In 2015, the Japanese and South Korean governments reached an agreement attempting to resolve the comfort women issue. Japan agreed to provide 1 billion yen to a foundation supporting surviving comfort women, and South Korea agreed to consider the matter finally and irreversibly resolved. The agreement was negotiated between governments without meaningful consultation with the survivors themselves, who largely rejected it as inadequate. They had not sought mere financial settlements, but comprehensive acknowledgement, legal responsibility, and educational reforms ensuring future generations would learn accurate history. Many survivors refused the settlement money, viewing acceptance as complicity in the erasure of their experiences. They wanted acknowledgement that what was done to them was criminal, not compensation that framed their suffering as something that could be bought off with belated payments. They wanted Japan to teach school children about the comfort women system with the same detail that German schools taught about the Holocaust, ensuring that historical memory would prevent repetition. They wanted the perpetrator's nation to fully reckon with what had been done in its name, not to paper over atrocities with diplomatic compromises. As the years passed and the survivors aged into their 80s and 90s, the urgency of their cause intensified. Each year brought more deaths, more voices silenced forever, more living testimony lost to time. The women who had survived decades of silence and decades of advocacy began dying before receiving the justice they had fought for. Lee Ok-seon, still alive and active in her mid-90s, continued attending weekly protests outside the Japanese embassy, her presence a rebuke to those who hoped the issue would die with the generation that experienced it. Maria Rosa Henson died in 1997, 6 years after coming forward with her testimony. She had spent those final years speaking publicly about her experience, writing a memoir that became one of the first detailed personal accounts of comfort women's lives, and advocating for Filipino survivors who needed medical and psychological support. Her death represented not just personal loss, but the closing of one testimony among thousands that would never be fully heard or acknowledged. The comfort women survivors became symbols of broader struggles over historical memory, justice for wartime sexual violence, and the rights of victims to have their experiences recognized and their suffering addressed. Their advocacy inspired other movements of women survivors of sexual violence in armed conflict, from Bosnia to Rwanda to Syria, providing models for breaking silence and demanding accountability. The principles they fought for that sexual violence in warfare is a crime requiring prosecution and compensation, became international legal norms codified in treaties and enforced by international tribunals. But for the survivors themselves, international legal developments and diplomatic resolutions remained abstract compared to the lived reality of carrying trauma for 70 years, while societies and governments minimized, denied, or ignored what had been done to them. Many expressed that their greatest pain came not from the original violence, devastating as it was, but from the decades of silencing that followed, the social stigma that blamed them for their victimization, the governmental indifference that prioritized diplomatic relations over survivor needs. The statues erected in their honor tell part of the story. Bronze sculptures of young girls sitting on chairs, empty chairs beside them inviting viewers to sit and contemplate, appear in cities across Asia and around the world. The statues are called peace monuments, their purpose to ensure that comfort women are not forgotten even after the last survivor dies. But the statues also generate controversy, with the Japanese government requesting their removal, viewing them as provocations that damage diplomatic relations rather than appropriate memorials to historical injustice. In Seoul, the most famous statue sits across from the Japanese embassy, erected by activists in 2011. The statue depicts a teenage girl in traditional Korean dress, her face solemn, her hands clenched in her lap, her feet not quite touching the ground to symbolize the powerlessness of the comfort women. An empty chair beside her invites people to sit, to share her vigil, to witness her silent protest. Every Wednesday, surviving comfort women and their supporters gather at this statue for the weekly demonstration that has continued for over 30 years, demanding acknowledgement and apology from a government that continues to view full accountability as politically impossible. The protests continue even as the survivors die, younger generations taking up the cause, recognizing that justice delayed for 70 years cannot be abandoned simply because those who suffered are passing. The movement has evolved from survivor testimony to intergenerational activism, from personal accounts to historical documentation, from individual grievance to collective memory work. The comfort women have become part of how Korea, China, the Philippines, and other affected nations understand their wartime experiences and their post-war relationships with Japan. For Japan, the comfort women issue represents unresolved tension between acknowledgement and denial, between progressive internationalism and conservative nationalism, between accepting responsibility for historical crimes and protecting national pride. Different Japanese governments have offered varying degrees of acknowledgement, from the relatively forthright Kono Statement in 1993 to more recent statements that minimize military involvement or question survivor credibility. The political winds shift with elections and diplomatic priorities, but the underlying conflict remains unresolved. Educational curricula in Japanese schools mention the comfort women system only briefly, if at all, with some textbooks using passive voice and euphemistic language that obscures Japanese military responsibility. Conservative politicians have successfully pressured textbook publishers to remove or soften references to comfort women, arguing that detailed discussion of wartime atrocities promotes anti-Japanese sentiment. The result is that most young Japanese people learn little about the comfort women system, continuing the pattern of erasure that survivors have fought for decades to overcome. In contrast, South Korean schools teach about comfort women as part of lessons on Japanese colonial occupation, ensuring that young Koreans understand this aspect of their national history. The Philippines, China, Taiwan, and Indonesia have incorporated comfort women history into their educational systems with varying degrees of depth and accuracy. The different national approaches to teaching this history reflect broader patterns of how societies remember and process traumatic pasts, which elements they choose to emphasize or minimize, how they balance historical accuracy against political considerations. The comfort women Survivors who remained alive into the 2020s continued their advocacy even as their numbers dwindled to single digits in each country. They attended international conferences via video link when travel became impossible due to age and health. They gave interviews to documentarians and researchers working to preserve their testimonies before death silenced them. They participated in virtual meetings with younger activists, passing the torch of advocacy to generations who would carry the fight forward after the last survivor died. Lee Ok-seon, among the longest-lived and most active survivors, spent her final years in a Seoul nursing home run by an organization supporting comfort women survivors. She continued giving interviews and participating in protests when her health allowed, determined to speak as long as she had breath. In interviews, she expressed mixed feelings about her activism, pride in having broken silence and contributed to historical recognition, but also frustration that full justice remained elusive, that Japan still hadn't provided the comprehensive acknowledgement and education she believed was necessary, that she would likely die before seeing her fight concluded. The question of what justice looks like for crimes committed 75 years ago has no simple answer. Financial compensation cannot undo what was done or restore the lives that were destroyed. Official apologies ring hollow when followed by denials from other government officials or revisions of historical textbooks. The survivors wanted something that perhaps no government could fully provide: recognition that what happened to them was wrong, that they were victims rather than collaborators, that their suffering mattered and their voices deserved to be heard without qualification or equivocation. The comfort women movement ultimately transcends the specific historical case it addresses, becoming a broader statement about how societies deal with wartime sexual violence, how nations confront uncomfortable histories, how victim testimony is received or dismissed based on political convenience. The survivors' decades-long fight for recognition has inspired similar movements among survivors of sexual violence in other conflicts, providing strategies and language for naming crimes that societies prefer to ignore, for demanding accountability from powers that benefit from silence. As the last survivors pass away, the movement faces questions about how to maintain momentum without living voices, how to preserve testimony in ways that remain compelling to future generations, how to ensure that comfort women history doesn't become footnote rather than central chapter in World War II narratives. Museums and memorial sites attempt to answer these questions through exhibits, education programs, and preserved testimony, creating permanent records of what temporary lives experienced. The House of Sharing in South Korea, a residence for surviving comfort women, has become museum and memorial where visitors can learn detailed history of the comfort women system. The facility preserves rooms where survivors lived, displays their artwork and personal belongings, screens documentary footage of their testimonies. It's both monument and active community, housing the last few survivors while educating thousands of visitors annually about what was done to them and their advocacy for justice. Similar institutions exist in other affected countries, each approaching the history through national and cultural lenses that reflect how different societies process trauma and seek justice. The Lila Pilipina Center in Manila provides support services for Filipino survivors while preserving their oral histories and advocating for compensation. Museums in China document comfort women alongside other aspects of Japanese wartime occupation, contextualizing sexual slavery within broader narratives of national suffering and resistance. These varied approaches reflect the complex ways that comfort women history intersects with national identity, gender politics, and international relations. For the women themselves, in their final years, the advocacy had become inseparable from their identities. They were no longer just comfort women survivors, but activists, witnesses, historical figures whose lives embodied broader struggles for justice and recognition. Some expressed that the activism had given meaning to suffering that otherwise would have destroyed them completely, that breaking silence and fighting for acknowledgement had been healing in ways that silence never could be. even if the fight remained incomplete. Others expressed ambivalence about having become public figures, about having their worst experiences become the primary way they were known and remembered. They had lives beyond those years of enslavement, had built families and careers, had experienced love and loss and ordinary joys and sorrows. But their public identities became fixed to those traumatic years, their personhood reduced to their victimization, in ways that replicated rather than healed the dehumanization they had experienced in comfort stations. The final Wednesday protests outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul continue with dwindling numbers of actual survivors, their places increasingly filled by younger supporters, students, activists, ordinary citizens who believe the fight must continue beyond the survivor generation. The protests have become ritualized, scripted through repetition, but they maintain their power as visible reminder that some injustices cannot be allowed to fade simply because time passes and victims die. As of this recording, only a handful of Comfort Women survivors remain alive, all in their 90s, all suffering various health conditions that come with advanced age. Each death makes headlines in Korea, marking not just individual loss, but the approaching end of living testimony. The transition from immediate history to recorded history. The activists surrounding these final survivors work frantically to preserve everything possible, conducting final interviews, recording last testimonies, ensuring that when the last survivor dies, the historical record will be as complete as possible. But they know that recorded testimony, however comprehensive, cannot replicate the power of living voices, cannot carry the emotional weight of women in their 90s saying, "This happened to me. I survived this. I demand recognition for what was done." The movement will change fundamentally when the last survivor passes, becoming something different, necessarily mediated through documentation rather than direct testimony. The Comfort Women story doesn't have a satisfying ending because the justice the survivors sought remains incomplete. Japan has offered apologies that fall short of what survivors demanded. Compensation schemes have been established and rejected as inadequate. Educational reforms have been implemented in some countries but resisted in others. The diplomatic compromises that governments reached have been repudiated by many survivors who rejected being bargained away in interstate agreements they didn't authorize. What remains is a complicated legacy of silence broken, voices raised, historical truth documented and preserved even if not fully acknowledged. The Comfort Women who came forward transformed themselves from victims silenced by shame into activists demanding recognition, from individuals carrying private trauma into a collective movement seeking historical justice. They forced their societies and the international community to confront wartime sexual violence in ways that have influenced how similar crimes in subsequent conflicts are understood and prosecuted. Their courage in breaking decades of silence has inspired countless other survivors of sexual violence to speak, to refuse shame for crimes committed against them, to demand accountability from perpetrators and recognition from societies that prefer to maintain comfortable fictions rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. The Comfort Women movement became template for truth-telling and justice-seeking that extends far beyond its original context. But for the individual women who lived this history, the legacy is more personal and painful. They survived years of sexual slavery only to survive decades of silencing, only to survive years of advocacy that brought recognition but not full justice. They lived long enough to see their stories documented, their suffering acknowledged, their demands elevated to international diplomatic discourse. But they also lived long enough to see how societies and governments resist full accountability, how historical truth can be simultaneously recognized and denied, how victims' voices can be amplified but not fully heard. As we tell their stories now, with most of the survivors gone and the rest approaching the ends of their lives, we inherit responsibility to carry forward the witness they bore. Their testimony has been given, recorded, preserved. The question is what we will do with it, how we will teach future generations about this systematic crime, how we will honor the courage it took to break silence and speak truth that societies preferred to ignore. The comfort women deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as survivors who refused to be silenced, as activists who fought for justice against enormous odds, as women whose voices changed how the world understands wartime sexual violence and survivor rights. Their stories are difficult to hear because they document systematic cruelty and societal failure. But they must be heard because silence protected perpetrators while destroying victims, and breaking that silence remains the only path toward anything resembling justice for crimes that can never be undone, but must be acknowledged and remembered.